When people say the sexual revolution has been a slippery slope toward increasing degeneracy, they're not wrong. However, I would slightly alter that description. The slippery slope isn't exactly accurate. You see, the slippery slope describes a course of action likely to lead to something bad or disastrous. However, in the case of the sexual revolution, this has been more like a snowball rolling down a hill. Not only does the snowball move down the hill relentlessly, but it also gathers speed and mass as it travels. This for me is a perfect analogy for the destructive process of sexual liberalization. Not only has this trend moved in a dangerous direction, but over time it has accelerated and gained momentum whilst also becoming larger and encompassing an ever-growing number of degenerate lifestyles. Eventually, this snowball has become like a veritable avalanche of degeneracy which threatens to crush everything decent and wholesome that lies in its path. But I am well aware that all of what I say will be hotly contested by liberal-minded folk and those who push the LGBT agenda. LGBT, for anyone that has been living under a rock, stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender. And when I say LGBT agenda, I'm not attacking every single person who isn't heterosexual. Over the course of my political career, I have met many individuals who aren't heterosexual and who are appalled by the debased degeneracy and the overtly destructive and hypersexualized material peddled by the cultural Marxists who push the LGBT agenda. It is important to note that not every homosexual seeks to walk down the street in a black leather thong with a pink feather boa around his neck, like an extra from the Blue Oyster Bar. And if you don't get the Blue Oyster Bar reference, you probably didn't grow up in the 80s watching Police Academy, but I'm sure you can find the scene on YouTube. You see, I'm not criticising people for simply being homosexual. I'm criticising those who push the LGBT agenda and who wish to portray homosexuality as normal, natural, and most importantly, as a viable and healthy alternative to heterosexual relations and the traditional nuclear family. And that is exactly what the cultural Marxists have done. They have taken homosexuality out of the closet and they have pushed the LGBT agenda and used it to make increasingly degenerate acts acceptable in order to open the door for far worse. And the LGBT agenda has paved the way for a vast array of other damaging and degenerate types of sexual behaviour to become normalised. You see, the LGBT agenda is just another attack on the West perpetuated by cultural Marxists who are committed to the eventual destruction of everything that underpins Western society. And before anyone says the LGBT agenda is all about equality, it's just about equal rights and doing what's fair and just by homosexuals, well, that is rubbish. And I can debunk that argument rather quickly and effectively. For any of you who have been to a so-called gay pride festival or observed one in pictures or on the television, what have you seen? What sights do you behold? Now, if homosexuals were looking to simply be accepted, to be seen as normal, and just wanted to be seen as everyday folk who just happened to have a different sexual preference, how do you think they should act? How do you think they would act? Well, if that was the case, I would expect gay pride marches and events to be a group of men and women dressed completely normally, maybe even dressed how they would do every day for work, walking down the street in an ordered fashion with signs saying something like, "We're just like you, but we simply have a different sexual preference. Seeing men and women walking down the street with such signs, dressed in suits, work clothes, or other regular attire, and with placards pointing out their similarities to others, would surely be the best way to call for equality and harmony, would it not? However, the idea of people dressed normally parading down the street in an ordered and respectable fashion is about as far from gay pride as you could possibly get. Gay pride marches are not about equality. They are about pushing degeneracy. And this can be seen quite clearly by the sights that can be seen there. I've seen images from gay pride events where men walk down the street naked, where men dressed as dogs are led down the street on all fours by other men. I've seen pictures of groups of people with giant blow-up penises, or those who are waving sex toys. In fact, displays of nudity, perversion, bondage, and extreme sexual fetishes are the norm for these type of events. At a gay pride rally, you could find almost every form of sick and debased sexual fetish being celebrated and openly flaunted in a public place. But let's take a step back for a second. Let's draw a little comparison. If a father was to take his 13-year-old son to a strip club to see some boobs, most 13-year-old boys love boobs and are very, very curious about females, especially attractive ones. What do you think would happen to that father? Now, I'm betting if it was publicly revealed that he had taken his son to a strip club, he would be publicly admonished. In fact, he would be pilloried and would likely be interviewed by social services and the police, and potentially may lose access to his child. Now, before anyone starts in the comments, I'm not saying fathers should take their children to strip clubs. As much as most 13-year-old boys would want to see boobs, that's not good parenting. But we're drawing a comparison here. So please let me continue. For allowing a 13-year-old boy into a strip club to see topless ladies, a parent would be strung up. But what would happen if the same father took his 13-year-old son to a gay pride rally? The boy would see all manner of sexual depravity and would certainly be exposed to far worse than simply bare breasts. In fact, that boy would see sadomasochism, the boy would see full frontal nudity, the boy would see sex toys and all manner of sexualized material. He would see men sucking on lollipops shaped as penises. He would see other men dressed as leather-clad dogs crawling down the street for the pleasure of their partner. And he would probably see far, far worse. In fact, if a father took his 13-year-old son to a gay pride rally, that boy would be exposed to far more sexualized material, degeneracy, and sick sexual fetishes than he would ever see at a strip club. Yet let's look at how the father would be treated for taking his son to a gay pride rally. Would he be admonished, as he would if he took his son to the relatively tame strip club? No. For taking a 13-year-old boy to a gay pride rally and exposing that boy to all that sexual madness and depravity, a parent would be held up as a beacon of tolerance and decency. The father would be praised as progressive and open-minded and congratulated for bringing his son up with such wondrous liberal values. You see how this works? Now, I'm not saying that 13-year-old boys should be taken to strip clubs. But what I am saying is that a strip club pales into comparison when it comes to the sexually charged and debased scenes that are witnessed at a gay pride event. Yet those events are encouraged, and parents who take their children along to them are smiled upon. And this is just a small example of how this push for sexual liberalisation and so-called equality isn't actually about equality, but is about pushing a damaging agenda that eats away at the moral fabric of our society. But as I said earlier, the sexual liberalisation of the Western world is like a snowball rolling down a hill. And what was outrageous and pushed the envelope of decency yesterday is relatively passé and normal by today's standard. Equally, what is outrageous today and pushes the bounds of decency will likely be normalised tomorrow. This is how the cultural Marxists push an agenda, and over time the snowball rolls down the hill, gathering both momentum and mass as it crashes through every barrier and bulwark of decency. But the most worrying aspect of the sexual liberalisation of the West is that it is going far further than just normalising homosexuality. It's going far further than gay pride events or shows of public nudity or sexual fetishes. The same people who once pushed the LGBT agenda are now pushing the liberalisation of attitudes toward incest, bestiality, and even paedophilia. And yet again, the cultural Marxists are using the media to do this. And if you don't believe me, here are some examples, and not from minor back-alley publications, but from major news sources that have millions of readers. We'll get started with the Huffington Post, which has run several articles on incest. One headline read, "Incest should be legal, experts argue." And they've run other similar articles, and the comment sections are usually rather horrifying. New York Magazine ran an article on an anonymous man who was in a relationship with a horse. Yep, you heard me right. He was in a relationship with a horse. New York Magazine wrote, "But the sexual identity that can be attached to bestiality, zoophilia, remains little understood." In 2002, the sex therapist Hani Miletsky published Understanding Bestiality and Zoophilia, a book based on her study of almost 100 zoophiles. Research that led her to conclude that many form deep, loving, and very nurturing relationships with their animal partners. Salon ran an article on Todd Nickerson, a self-proclaimed paedophile who wrote of how he was not a monster. In the article, Salon tried to normalise paedophilia as just another sexual orientation, which is only harmful if the paedophile chooses to act on those urges. Vice, an online news site that also has a channel on Sky, ran with the headline, "A paedophile opens up about being targeted by vigilantes." This article talks about the stigma attached to being a paedophile. It then goes on to attempt to make the reader feel sorry for the paedophile in question, before finally asserting that stigmatising paedophiles can in fact endanger children. All of the links to the articles I've mentioned can be found in the description below. But what ties all of these articles together, other than the fact that they push for increased sexual liberalisation and for the envelope of degeneracy to be pushed even further? Well, what unites these articles is the way that they frame their arguments. All of these articles frame their arguments using emotion, in the same way that the media push the LGBT agenda based on the argument that if two consenting adults want to do something, why shouldn't they do it? And why shouldn't they do it in public? They now push incest. After all, they argue, if two grown adult siblings want to be in a relationship, why shouldn't they? Sure, the children they may have may be born with severe defects, but they can use contraception. What is it of your business? You see what they are doing? Just in the same way that they normalised homosexuality, and with just the same arguments, they seek to normalise things that are far worse. The emotional tricks these people use to convince the public of their warped agenda also usually involve making the public feel sorry for the sickos and mentally ill perverts who they wish to normalize. For example, the article from New York Magazine stated that many people who have relationships with animals form deep, loving, and very nurturing relationships with their animal partners. Note the use of the word love. The cultural Marxists can't get enough of the word love, and in their push for gay marriage to be adopted, used that word relentlessly. In fact, the phrase legalize love was often used as a campaign slogan for the gay rights movement. And that slogan is now being used to push for far darker taboos to be dragged out of the closet. Because after all, who can deny love? No further arguments are needed other than that appeal to emotion. The final trick the media use is to make you feel sorry for those who carry out acts of bestiality, incest, or even paedophilia. Vice talks of the hardships paedophiles face when being targeted by vigilantes and uses words like stigma to make you feel pity for child molesters. Salon does the same thing, asking readers not to judge paedophiles without first listening to them. All the buzzwords and emotional tricks these people have used to normalize homosexuality are now being used to ensure that the total sexual liberalization of the West is achieved. The enemies of the West started the ball rolling with the legalization and acceptance of homosexuality, which went from simply allowing homosexuals the right to do as they wished in the privacy of their own homes, to allowing public displays of completely debased and degenerate acts, and then finally to allowing gay marriage and even gay adoption. Now, the enemies of the West are pushing the envelope of degeneracy even further. All the emotional cues are rolled out. One shouldn't judge. A person should never be stigmatized for their sexual identity. Sexuality isn't a choice. These people are born this way. What adults do is their own business. And finally, and most importantly, love should never be illegal. And all of a sudden, the public who have been conditioned to accept these flawed but highly emotionally charged arguments are now seeing these arguments used to normalize the most vile and twisted sexual practices imaginable: bestiality, incest, and even paedophilia. You see, cultural Marxists didn't push this aggressive LGBT agenda because they care about homosexuals. They pushed it because it was destructive to moral values and decency and undermined central pillars of Western society, like the traditional family. If these cultural Marxists cared for homosexuals, they wouldn't be flooding the West with Muslims. But that's the point. All cultural Marxists care for is destroying the European people and Western civilization. And they will use any means necessary to do so. And sexual liberalization and the LGBT agenda is just another means to an end for them. The cultural Marxists pushed the LGBT agenda as they knew what they were doing and where it would lead. They started that snowball rolling in order to bury the West under an avalanche of degeneracy.